Now we're going to talk about economic fluctuations. We're going to put all this together. We've got our aggregate supply and demand. Here's long-run aggregate supply. Here's aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. So here we are, we're at the long-run equilibrium. That means that perceptions, expectations, wages, prices, everything have fully adjusted so that the intersection of aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, we're right there, right smack on the long-run aggregate supply curve, meaning we are producing at the natural level of output. Implied there is that if we're at the natural level of output, we're also at the natural rate of unemployment. And here's the current price level. Okay, well, here we've got happy days. We've got stocks, stock market's up, and the war is ending. Okay, confidence is high, and everything's looking great. So, what's happening here? Well, stocks. Well, here's our components of GDP, or aggregate demand. Well, a high stock market's going to increase consumption, but it's also going to increase investment too. High stock market will make it cheaper for firms to raise financing. They get a bigger bang for their per share of stock that they issue, and that can stimulate financing and capital investment as well. So that is going to shift the aggregate demand curve out to the right. And here we are, a new equilibrium. We have an increasing price level. We have increased output. But notice that we've got this expansion going, but we have inflation going too. So on this graph, let's go up here a little bit. Going back to our business cycle graph, where we plot GDP over time, we've got these fluctuations. Right now, we're up here somewhere. Okay, we're at a point in time where this is the long-run equilibrium, but we're actually up here. Okay, now you can see this is the long-run equilibrium, but we're up here above it. Okay, and that's what's happening here. We're above. Here's the long run. We're actually above it temporarily. Can't be there. Can't be above the long-run sustainable output, for very long. But we are. We're cruising along. We've got some inflation, and that's what it looks like on this graph. We're up here. And note that with output above our natural level of output, unemployment would be below its natural rate of unemployment. So let's say unemployment is 5%. Typically, it's going to be below that during this boom here, maybe 4%. Okay, something below the natural rate. Well, what's going to happen? Ultimately, expectations will catch up to the new reality of a higher output and higher prices. So now we're going to begin to see a change in the expected price level. Okay, so expectations are gradually going to change, and that is going to How do we reflect? How do we model changes in expectations? Well, here we go. This is going to be shifting up gradually as expectations change, and we're going to move right along here until, boom, there's our new short-run aggregate supply curve, and we stop right there. And we've got a little bit higher prices there, but output is back to long-run equilibrium. So we have aggregate demand shifting out in response to this high stock market and confidence, and everything's wonderful and everyone's excited, and wow, economy's booming, but we got inflation. But over time, those expectations will start to settle in. They'll start to change. This inflation, this new higher inflation, is going to change people's expectations, firms' expectations, and they're going to start to express those changes, and we model those changes in expectations by this shifting curve is going up, going to shift up or back to the left. And that's what brings us back into equilibrium. And that's what will happen. And on this graph, that would be, we're kind of back here. So we've gone, whoa, and now we're back right there. A major driver in this change is because of this inflation, workers will demand higher wages to keep up with this new expansion and new inflation. So think back to the examples we gave before. As workers want higher wages and say, look, we got to have higher wages. This inflation wasn't expected. It's higher than expected. So we look, our expectations have changed. We thought it was going to be 5%. It's actually 10%, and looks like it's going to keep being 10%. So the higher wages increase firms' costs, and it drives us back here to the long-run equilibrium. Okay, so what did we just learn? An aggregate demand shift in the short run will cause a fluctuation in output. It'll cause that change in output. But in the long run, aggregate demand shifts will cause a change in the price level, but no change in output. So in the short run, a change in output, yes, from a change in aggregate demand, but not in the long run. All you'll be left with is a change in the price level, as we saw here. We saw aggregate demand shift out to the right, and we saw the higher price level. Then with the change in expectations, as a result of all that, we saw the shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve upward, reflecting higher costs, higher wages, and we're back from here, we're back to here. But this stays with us. Basically, we just went along there. Now let's look at how this model does in explaining real-world events. We'll start with the Great Depression. Here are the facts of the Great Depression. From 1929 to 1933, real GDP fell 27%. That's enormous. Unemployment went from 3% to 25%. And prices, the overall price level fell 22%. So how would we model this with our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model? We can, here's our long run aggregate supply. Here's our short run aggregate supply. Here's our aggregate demand. Okay, well, we start out here in equilibrium. There's our equilibrium price. Here's our equilibrium quantity. All right, so what happened? The Great Depression was the result of an enormous decline in aggregate demand. Prices fell, like I said, 27%. GDP fell 27%, and unemployment went from 3% to 25%. So this is minus 27% here. Wait, sorry. Wrong number. This was 22%. So prices were down 22%. This here in output, this is minus 27% in output. And unemployment, well, went from 3% to 25%. Okay. So unemployment was 3% here and 25% here. Okay. So why was there such a huge decrease in aggregate demand? Well, first of all, stock prices collapsed. There was a huge stock market crash, okay, and that meant consumption falls. Consumption is about roughly 2/3 of GDP, okay, or aggregate demand. So that's a huge hit right there. But even then, this was your ordinary recession until the bank failures. With the bank failures, think back to multiple deposit creation. How deposits in the bank, depending on the multiplier, each dollar deposits will support a multiple of that in money supply. Now think of that in reverse. Everybody's panicking. Now remember, back then, we didn't have the FDIC. We didn't have insured deposits. Banks were just like other businesses, and they failed. And if your money was in a bank that went out of business, that was tough luck. So with people being nervous, withdrawing their money, and banks don't have the money there in the safe. They've lent it out. So everybody wants their money at once. The bank doesn't have it, and the bank closes its doors. And as banks failed over and over and over, the money supply fell by 28%. So, so that's why you had this enormous shift. So prior to the bank, let's say this is the shift with the stock market crash. Okay, well, that's not a very good line. Here we are. We got a little recession going. Not fun. But here it is. Add all the bank failures, and it just shifted this aggregate demand curve way left. So that is basically the Great Depression. And our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model does a great job of explaining it. It was simply a major collapse in aggregate demand. Well, stock prices got us into a recession as consumption fell. Bank failures put us into the Great Depression, and that's where the Federal Reserve dropped the ball. They just, in all fairness, like I say, hindsight's 20/20. But you look at how the Federal Reserve handled the Great Depression. These bank failures, it's astonishing. With today's knowledge, it's astonishing. But that's what put us in the Great Depression. So how might we have gotten out of the Great Depression? Well, here we are again with aggregate demand way back here. Prices have collapsed, output collapsed, unemployment sky high. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen is over time, as expectations change, so we've got falling prices. That means and this is a good way to think of the short-run aggregate supply curve. We've got firms saying to their employees, hey, employees, sorry, guys, we have got to cut your wages because the price of our product has gone way down here, and yet you're still earning wages, way up here. So over time, as those expectations change and as workers as well begin to accept that the things have changed, over time, we've got the short-run aggregate supply curve shifting down. And over time, gradually, we've got we're back at full employment. Right here, we're back at full employment, natural rate of output, but we've got lower price level. That's what would have happened if things were just left to themselves. So, however, there were a couple of things that kept prices from falling, or wages, for one. One was the minimum wage was instituted. They for some reason, I mean, again, this is hindsight's always 20/20. But the President Roosevelt did a couple of things. One thing, he tried to keep agricultural prices high by destroying food. I mean, you think about that. People are going hungry in the Great Depression, yet you're destroying food to try to shift the supply of food back to keep prices high. Well, prices didn't need to be high. They needed to be allowed to fall. And wages, they instituted a minimum wage, and wages needed to come down. And so this adjustment was this adjustment here was absolutely practically prohibited. So they did exactly the wrong thing, and that's one reason why the Great Depression lasted so long, is every time it started to recover, they'd slap on something that stopped it from recovering. So it's really too bad because they didn't know any better, but these regulations literally kept us from recovering from the Great Depression. So what got us out of the Great Depression? Oh, well, also, because of the stickiness of wages going down, certainly, that would have been a very long process anyway. Even if the regulations didn't stop at the adjustment in its tracks, but the economy did show signs of coming back every now and then the Roosevelt administration would slap on some new regulations that would stop the recovery. They thought they were helping it. They were doing just the opposite. So at least as far as the recovery, these things. But what they did do that was right was they enacted some programs to help people. People desperately needed help, and they instituted some programs to keep people, from starving and all that. But as far as helping the economy actually recover, well, that was a mixed bag there. John Maynard Keynes pointed out, back then, the economists were basically saying, just leave it alone, and this will happen. These shifts will take place, and everything will adjust. Wages will adjust, prices will adjust, and we'll be back at full output and full employment. And that's true. That would have happened. It would have taken a long time. And John Maynard Keynes, who is really the inventor of macroeconomics, saw things differently. He said, in the long run, everything will be okay. But Keynes's response to that was, in the long run, we're all dead. So you may have heard that comment before. In the long run, we're all dead. And Keynes saw that this adjustment, even if left alone, even if without the regulations stopping it, even if it was allowed to take place, would take a long time. Keynes was asked if he'd seen anything like the Great Depression. He said, yeah, the Dark Ages. They lasted for 400 years or whatever it was. So he saw that this was going to take a long time. And what Keynes advocated was that government get involved and shift this aggregate demand curve back out here through government increases in spending. Now, Roosevelt administration did do some of that, to their credit. So I think the best description of the response was there was one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake. They had the foot on the brake, not allowing this downward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve, and then they had a foot on the gas with this increase in government spending, but it was not nearly on the level that Keynes advocated. Keynes thought it should be a lot more, and apparently that was the case. Now, so what did end the Great Depression? I better draw a new graph here. What ended the Great Depression was World War II. War may be hell, but for the economy, it may be. In this case, what it did was we're way back here with aggregate demand, and large chunks of government spending shifted this aggregate demand curve back out. In fact, it went out the other way. We actually went from this Great Depression to way out here to an economic boom. And let me draw a little better graph here. Okay, so with World War II, when we're still here in the Great Depression, aggregate demand is way down here, and it gradually shifts out as government spending on tanks and airplanes and all kinds of things for war. But it didn't stop here. It just kept on going way out to here. So we went from the Great Depression way out here to an economic boom. And the situation was unemployment was about 1%. See, back here, unemployment was 25%. Out here is 1%. And GDP increased 5 times. I mean, it just exploded from here out to here. And what, again? Government spending increased. And that's what Keynes was advocating, to shift the aggregate demand curve back out here. But it never was done on a scale large enough. And it took the war by force to shift it way out, not just to here, but actually out here, and we had an economic boom during World War II. Now let's talk about the economic stagflation in the early 1970s. Crude oil is a major input into our economy, and some of the largest economic fluctuations have been from an interruption of the flow of oil. Now, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, a cartel, they banded together and they cut the output of oil. You know, they can act as a monopoly. And that sent oil prices doubled from 1973 to 75. Oil prices doubled. What's that going to do to cost and inflationary expectations? So what happened there is this sent the short-run aggregate supply curve shifting up. We call that a shock, okay, a supply shock. So now we're back here. We have falling GDP, and we have rising prices. Okay, falling GDP and rising prices. In the Keynesian world, that was not supposed to happen. We weren't supposed to have inflation and recession at the same time. Here we have a recession. We have falling GDP. Here we have inflation. We have rising prices. And during that time, we had inflation of over 10%. And unemployment was 4.9%. In 1973. And by 1975, it was 8.5%. Now contrast this to 1986, when two of the OPEC countries couldn't get along. In fact, Iran and Iraq were at war. So that's not exactly getting along. And how did they finance their war? By increasing their output of oil. I mean, OPEC's, they're all banding together to act as a monopoly. They're cutting back production of oil so they can get a higher price for it. And in microeconomics, you'll learn that goods that are inelastic in demand, when the price goes up, revenues go up. And so they were holding back output to get higher prices and higher revenues. However, Iran and Iraq, well, they needed money to fight their war against each other. So they're cranking out oil like crazy. So what that does is send oil prices down. And again, since oil is such an important input into our economy, that sends the short-run aggregate supply curve down. And so what we've got there is decreasing prices, a price level, and an economic boom. And here in 1986, we had a little spurt in economic activity. And I don't think the price level, this is where the model doesn't exactly get it right. The price level in this case didn't actually fall, but the rate of inflation fell. Okay, so the rate of inflation fell. We still had rising prices, but not nearly as much. We'd been coming out of that the price inflation of the high inflation of the late 70s, and in the early 80s we were still getting that down, but it brought it down and it increased output. And there we have it. Our little economic model does a pretty darn good job of modeling these events, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So that concludes our introduction to our economic model. Now in the next chapter, we're going to look at government attempts. We've already kind of talked about this, but just by way of introduction, when demand is less than where we want it to be, government might be able to stimulate demand, here we are, to move it back out here. And there are two ways to do this. The Federal Reserve Bank can use what is called monetary policy to try to shift aggregate demand through capital investment, that they can alter the money supply and interest rates, and if they want to shift aggregate demand to the right, they can put pressure on interest rates to go down, making capital investment cheaper, and shift the aggregate demand curve out to the right. The other is called fiscal policy, and that there's two things involved in fiscal policy. There's tax rates. You could lower taxes so consumption goes up, or just government spending directly. New highways, new defense, new rockets, new whatever, okay? So that would be another way to shift aggregate demand. So what that's all about is demand management. They're trying to manage the aggregate demand curve, and that's what the next chapter is about, moving that demand curve around, and how, you know, can we really do it? I mean, you'll find it's hard. It's really hard to do this. So anyway, that's aggregate supply and aggregate demand.